Welcome back to Almost Famous, Lost Heroes and Forgotten Legends, the podcast dedicated to unearthing the real stories buried beneath layers of simplified history. If you're like me, you're probably tired of hearing the same old narratives, the same celebrated figures, while countless other brilliant, pivotal lives gather dust in the archives. Our mission, you see, is to correct those historical oversights, to shine a light on the trailblazers whose contributions were overlooked, suppressed, or just plain lost to time. We believe that understanding these forgotten legacies can truly inform our present and shape a more just future. Today, we're diving deep into a truly complex and often tragically simplified chapter of North American history, the story of an Odawa war chief named Pontiac, or Obwandiayag, and the pivotal yet often fragmented resistance movement that bears his name. Pontiac's War, as it came to be known, wasn't just a series of skirmishes. It was a profound moment of Indigenous unity and resistance against European dominance, a struggle whose full implications are still felt today, and it's a story rife with what-ifs, tragic ironies, and human resilience against overwhelming odds. Now, to truly grasp Pontiac's War, we first have to set the stage. Picture this. It's the early 1760s. The 7 Years' War, or what Americans often call the French and Indian War, has just wrapped up. France has lost, ceding vast territories, including the crucial Ohio Country and Great Lakes region, to the British. For many native nations who had long-standing alliances with the French, this was a seismic shift. The French, generally speaking, had established strategic trading posts and maintained what were often described as amicable relations, complete with customary gift-giving that signified respect and honor. Enter General Geoffrey Amherst, the new British commander-in-chief in North America. Amherst, bless his heart, had a rather direct approach. He believed that with the French gone, the Indigenous peoples would simply have to accept British rule and were, frankly, incapable of any serious resistance. So he cut off the traditional gift-giving, seeing it as nothing more than bribes. He also severely restricted the trade of gunpowder and ammunition, supplies that were absolutely essential for native communities to hunt and feed their families. This wasn't just an insult. It was an existential threat. These new policies were met with widespread resentment and hardship. Beyond the insult and the deprivation, there was a growing fear. British colonial expansion was relentless, pushing ever westward, displacing tribes like the Shawnees and Delawares. While not all tribes were immediately threatened, they were acutely aware of what was happening to their kin. It was a perfect storm, brewing with discontent. Amidst this turmoil, a powerful spiritual movement began to sweep through Indigenous communities. A Lenape prophet named Neil Lynn emerged, calling for a return to traditional ways, a rejection of European goods, alcohol, and weapons. Neil Lynn taught that the master of life was displeased with the Indigenous peoples for adopting the bad habits of the white man, and that the British themselves were a direct threat to their very existence, bringing sickness, smallpox, and their poison, meaning alcohol. This message resonated deeply with people whose world felt like it was spiraling out of their control. And this, my friends, is where Pontiac truly enters our story. Born around 1714 or 1720, likely in the Great Lakes region, Pontiac was already a war leader among the Odawa by 1747, a seasoned veteran of the French alliance against the British. He was profoundly inspired by Neil Lynn's teachings. By 1761, even before the official outbreak, rumors of a coordinated uprising were circulating, with Seneca leaders sending out war belts made of wampum, beaded belts used traditionally for symbolic messages and alliances, urging tribes to unite and drive out the British. On April 27, 1763, Pontiac convened a monumental council on the Ecorse River near Fort Detroit. It's said to have been the largest Indigenous council of its kind in the Western Territory, a gathering of chiefs and warriors from across the Great Lakes nations. Here, Pontiac laid out a list of grievances against the British, displayed a war belt, though historians now debate whether it truly came from the French king as he claimed, and passionately echoed Neil Lynn's call to purify themselves and prepare for a holy war to reclaim their ancestral lands. He urged a surprise attack on Fort Detroit, and through the distribution of these wampum belts, he rallied support and spread the message of resistance across numerous tribes: the Odawa, Ojibwe, Potawatomi, Huron, Delaware, Shawnee, Miami, Kickapoo, Mascoutin, Piankashaw, Seneca, and Wyandot. This wasn't a top-down military command in the European sense. Native nations were often decentralized, with no single chief speaking for an entire tribe. Yet Pontiac's charisma and the widespread grievances created what many historians now recognize as the first extensive multi-tribal resistance against European colonization in North America. The war exploded on May 7, 1763, with Pontiac leading an attempt to seize Fort Detroit by surprise. The plan was foiled by an informer, but Pontiac swiftly laid siege to the fort. As word of his actions spread, discontented Indigenous peoples across the region joined the revolt. The attacks weren't perfectly simultaneous, but they were coordinated and effective. 9 British forts were ultimately destroyed, and hundreds of colonists were killed or captured. Forts like Sandusky, St. Joseph, Miami, Michilimackinac, Venango, LeBoeuf, and Presque Isle fell. Fort Pitt was also put under siege, becoming a vital, contested point. Now, the brutality of this conflict cannot be overstated. Warfare on the frontier was indeed horrific, with both sides committing atrocities. But one aspect stands out as particularly chilling: the British use, or attempted use, of biological warfare. General Amherst, in a chilling exchange of letters with Colonel Henry Bouquet, explicitly suggested and endorsed spreading smallpox among the Indigenous tribes. And here's the kicker: officers at Fort Pitt had already tried this before Amherst's approval. On June 24, 1763, during a parley, Captain Simeon Ecuyer gave representatives of the besieging Delaware 2 blankets and a handkerchief that had been exposed to smallpox, hoping to spread the deadly disease. William Trent, the fort's militia commander, even noted in his journal, "I hope it will have the desired effect." Whether this particular act was effective is debated among historians. Some argue that smallpox transmission through fomites like blankets is less efficient than airborne, and that outbreaks were already occurring. But the intent, the sheer inhumanity of it, is undeniable. And it wasn't an isolated incident in the broader history of Native American contact. Historically, Indigenous populations were profoundly vulnerable to European diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, often suffering catastrophic mortality rates because they had no prior exposure or immunity. Overcrowding in communities and lack of access to safe drinking water, even centuries later, continued to make them high-risk groups for infectious diseases, as we saw with COVID-19. By 1764, the sheer scale of the Indigenous resistance had forced the British to rethink their strategy. They launched 2 major expeditions, one under Colonel John Bradstreet and another under Colonel Henry Bouquet, aiming to subdue the rebellion. Bradstreet, however, made some unauthorized treaties, which angered his superiors and demonstrated his lack of cultural understanding when he later destroyed a peace wampum belt sent by Pontiac, an act deeply insulting to the Indigenous delegates. Bouquet, on the other hand, was more successful in his mission, leading a force into Ohio country and securing the release of over 200 white captives. Ultimately, Pontiac's war ended not with a decisive British victory on the battlefield, but through negotiation and accommodation. The British realized they couldn't conquer the Indigenous nations, and the Indigenous peoples hadn't succeeded in completely driving out the British. It was, in essence, a military stalemate that forced significant changes in British policy. The most profound outcome for the British Crown was the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Hastily issued after news of the uprising reached London, this proclamation established a boundary line, creating a vast Indian reserve west of the Appalachian Mountains, forbidding colonial settlement on those lands. This was, in a way, a recognition of Indigenous land rights, and is still considered foundational in the relationship between the Canadian government and First Nations today. However, for American colonists, this proclamation was a major grievance, denying them the Western lands they felt they had earned, fueling resentment that contributed to the coming American Revolution. In a strange twist, the very war meant to secure British control ended up undermining it. For Pontiac himself, the story takes a tragic turn. His influence around Detroit waned, partly because the British singled him out for diplomatic efforts, which created resentment among other tribal leaders who felt he was claiming more authority than he truly possessed in a decentralized movement. He was increasingly ostracized, and eventually, on April 20th, 1769, he was assassinated by a Peoria warrior near Cahokia, Illinois, in what was apparently an act of personal vengeance. And here lies the deep, tragic irony of Pontiac's legacy. He envisioned a grand confederacy of Native American nations, united to maintain their sovereignty and traditional lands. His efforts sparked an unprecedented multi-tribal resistance, a blueprint for future leaders like Joseph Brant and Tecumseh. Yet, his own efforts were ultimately fragmented by internal divisions and the relentless external pressures of colonial powers. He strove for unity, but his own story became one of increasing isolation and a violent end, far from the unified vision he championed. His story, like so many others, has often been simplified, or worse, historically silenced. Early historical accounts, written primarily by European Jesuits and explorers, focused on their own perspectives, often portraying native societies as savage and flawed, while overlooking Indigenous oral traditions and the profound human complexity of their lives. Even the roles of Indigenous women, who held significant leadership, spiritual authority, and decision-making power in many pre-colonial societies, were systematically undermined and erased by the imposition of patriarchal European norms. But as we strive to tell these almost famous stories, we learn that the spirit of resistance, the deep sense of continuity with an unbroken heritage, persisted. Pontiac's War stands as a testament to the fact that even in the face of immense pressure, Indigenous peoples adapted, coped, and fought for their rights, their lands, and their ways of life. The lessons from Pontiac's struggle, the importance of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, and the ongoing fight against oppression continue to resonate deeply today. This is more than just history. It's a call to look closer, to listen harder, and to ensure that the stories of these forgotten heroes are finally heard, understood, and given the recognition they deserve.
If you're as fascinated by these stories as we are, please subscribe to the Almost Famous Lost Heroes and Forgotten Legends podcast, wherever you're listening. Your subscription helps us unearth more of these crucial narratives and ensures they get the recognition they deserve. We want to hear from you. What almost famous figure do you think deserves more recognition? Leave a comment, a review, or join the conversation and suggest future topics on our main YouTube channel, Almost Famous Lost Heroes and Forgotten Legends, helping us continue this vital work. Join us next time as we delve into another forgotten tale of unknown scientists, lost explorers, overlooked artists, or inventors on Almost Famous. Because remarkable people exist in every era, sometimes they just need someone to tell their story properly. Until then, keep exploring.